No to illustration, Governor Bradford's first dialogue. Ale or South Leaflets, 12th series, 1894, a dialogue, or the sum of a conference between some young men born in New England and sundry ancient men that came out of Holland and Old England, Anno Domini, 1648.1. 2. Our first request, therefore, is to know your minds concerning the true and simple meaning of those of the separation, as they are termed, when they say the Church of England is no church, or no true church. Ancient men. For answer hereunto, first you must know that they speak of it as it then was under the hierarchical prelacy, which since have been put down by the state, and not as it is now unsettled. Young men. Gentlemen, you were pleased to appoint us this time to confer with you, and to propound such questions as might give us satisfaction in some things wherein we are ignorant, or at least further light to some things that are more obscure unto us. They nowhere say that we remember that they are no church. 3. At least, they are not so to be understood, for they often say the contrary. T. Order. 4. When they say it is no true church of Christ, they do not at all mean it as they are the elect of God, or a part of the Catholic Church, or of the mystical body of Christ, or visible Christians professing faith and holiness as most men understand, faith and holiness as most men understand faith, church, for which purpose here what Mr. Robinson, in his Apology, page 53, if by the church, saith he, be understood the Catholic Church, dispersed upon the face of the whole earth, we do willingly acknowledge that a singular part thereof, and the same visible and conspicuous, is to be found in the land, and with it do profess and practice what in us lies, communion in all things in themselves lawful, and done in rye. Young men, wherein do they differ then from the judgment or practice of our churches here in New England? Therefore they mean it is not a true church, as it is a national church, combined together of all in the land, promiscuously under the hierarchical government of archbishops, their courts and canons, so far differing from the primitive pattern and primitive at all. Gospel. Called a true church? Ancient men. Truly, for matter of practice, nothing at all that is in anything material. These being rather more strict and rigid in some proceedings about admission of members and things of such nature than the other, and for matter of judgment, It is more, as we conceive, in words and terms, than matter of any great substance, for the Church. S. and chief of the ministers here hold that the national church, so constituted and governed as before is said, is not allowable according to the primitive order of the gospel, but that there are some parish assemblies that are true churches by virtue of an implicit covenant amongst themselves, in which regard the Church of England may be held, and where any such are evident, we suppose the other will not disagree about an implicit covenant, if they mean by an implicit covenant that which hath the substance of a covenant in it, some way discernible, though it be not so formal or orderly as it should be. But such an implicit covenant, as is no way explicit, is no better than a popish implicit faith, as some of us conceive, and a mere fiction, or as that which should be a marriage covenant, which is no way explicit. Young men, wherein standeth the difference between the rigid Brownists and Separatists and others, as we observe our ministers in their writings and sermons to distinguish them? Ancient men. The name of Brownists is but a nickname, as Puritan and Huguenot see, and therefore they do not amiss to decline the odium of it in what they may. But by the rigidness of separation they do not so much mean the difference, for our churches here in New England do the same thing under the name of secession from the corruptions found amongst them, as the other did under the name or term of separation from them. Only this declines the odium the better. See Reverend Mr. Cotton's answer to Mr. Bailey, page the 14th. Young men, we are well satisfied in what you have said, but they differ also about synods, that some which were termed separatists, out of some mistake and heat of zeal, forbore communion in lawful things with other godly persons, as prayer and hearing of the word, may be seen in what that worthy man dislike thereof, ancient men. It is true we do not know that ever they had any solemn synodical assembly, neither in Holland, where they might have more liberty, were they of any considerable number, being but those two churches, that of Amsterdam and that of Leyden. And the reason may be that those in England, living dispersed, and who could not meet in their ordinary meetings without danger, much less in synods, had they revoked the said position, and confessed their rashness and error, and lived together in peace some good time after. Yet some of us know that the Church of Leyden sent messengers to those of Amsterdam, at the request of some of the chief of them, both elders and brethren, when in their dissensions they had deposed Mr. Ainsworth, and some other both of their elders, and brethren, Mr. Robinson being the chief of the messengers sent, which had that good effect, as thieves, wholesome counsel of their brethren. But when the churches want neither peace nor light to exercise the power which the Lord hath given them, Christ doth not direct them to gather into synods or classical meetings for removing of known offences, either in doctrine or manners, but only sendeth to the pastors or presbyters of each church to reform within themselves what is amongst them. A plain pattern, saith Mr. Cotton in his answer to Mr. Bailey, page 95, in case of public offences tolerated in neighbour churches, not forthwith to gather into a synod or classical meeting for redress thereof, but by letters and messengers to our forefathers admonish one another of what is behooveful, unless upon such admonition they refuse to hearken to the people. And of this matter Mr. Robinson thus writeth in his book, Just, Ancient Men, it doth but seem so, as many things else do that have by usurpation grown out of use. Page 200, the officers of one or many churches may meet together to discuss and consider of matters for the good of the church or churches, and so be called a church synod or the like, so they infringe no order of Christ or liberty of faith. Brethren, not differing herein from Mr. Davenport and the principle of our ministers, but that it hath been an ancient practice of the people of God. Besides the grounds of Scripture, we will give an instance or two. Young men, but they seem to differ about the exercise of prophecy, that is, that men out of office, having gifts, may upon occasion edify the church publicly and openly, and applying the Scriptures, which seems to be a new practice. Cis cap dot id. We find in the ancient ecclesiastical history of Eusebius Libitor, he reporteth a manifest untruth, whenas there may be found such as in open assemblies have taught the people. Yea, whenas there were present learned men that could profit the people, and moreover holy bishops, who at that time exhorted them to preach. 19. How Demetrius, Bishop of Alexandria, being pricked with envy against Origen, complaineth in his letters that there was never such a practice heard of, nor no precedent to be found, that laymen in presence of bishops have taught in the church. Taught in the church is thus answered by the Bishop of Jerusalem and the Bishop of Caesarea. Where know not, say they, war, say they. The second instance is out of Speed's Cloud of Witnesses, page 71. For example, at Laranda Ewelpis was requested of Neon. At Iconium, Paulinus was requested by Celsus. At Synoda, Theodorus was requested by Atticus, who were godly brethren. See 15. He Levites, and the like did Paul and Barnabas, Acts 13. Saith he, Rambam or Maimon records, that in the synagogues, first, only a Levite must offer sacrifice, secondly, but any in Israel might expound the law, thirdly, the expounder must be an eminent man, and must have leave from the master of the fair, synagogue, and so contends that Christ, Luke the 4th, 16, taught as any of Israel might have done as well as he. If any out of weakness have abused at any time their liberty, it is their personal faulting, as sometimes weak ministers may their office, and yet the ordinance good and lawful, and the chief of our ministers in New England agree therein. See Mr. Cotton's answer to Bailey, page the 27th, 2d part. All scattered abroad, except the apostles, yet they that were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Emden, 1571, hath decreed in these words, first, in all churches, whether but springing up or grown to some ripeness, let the order of prophecy be observed, according to Paul's institution. Though neither all, says he, nor most of the brethren of a church have ordinarily received a gift of public prophesying, or preaching, yet in defect of public ministry, it is not an unheard-of novelty that God should enlarge private men without, and I, private men, public gifts, and 3, to dispense them to edification. For we read that when the church at Jerusalem were... Mr. Robinson also, in his Apology, page 45, chapter 8, to take off the aspersion charged on them, as if all the members of a church were to prophesy publicly, answers, "It comes within the compass, but of a few of the multitude, haply 2 or 3 in it. A church so to do, and touching prophecy, saith he, we think the very same that the synod held at it. So we believe and practice with the Belgic churches." See more in the immediate following page. Secondly, into the fellowship of this work are to be admitted not only the ministers, but the teachers too, as also of the elders and deacons, yea, even of the multitude, which are willing to confer their gift received of God to the common utility of the church, but so as they first be allowed by the judgment of the ministers and others. Young men, we cannot but marvel that in so few years there should be so great a change, that they who were so hotly persecuted by the prelates, and also opposed by the better sort of ministers, not only Mr. Gifford, Mr. Bernard, and other such like, but many of the most eminent, both for learning and godliness, and yet now, not only these famous and honoured churches in New England, so fully to close with them in practice, but all the godly party in the land to stand for the same way, under the new name of independence put upon them. Ancient men, it is the Lord's doing, and it ought to be marvellous in our eyes, and the rather because Mr. Bernard, in his book, made their small increase in a few years one, and the chief argument against the way itself, to which Mr. Robinson answered, that religion is not always sown and reaped in one age, and that John Huss and Jerome of Prague finished their testimony 100 years before Luther, and Wycliffe well nigh as long before them, and yet neither Bartholomew as long before them, and yet neither Thea, one nor the other with the like success as Luther. Folio 62, as if he had prophesied of these times. And yet, saith he, many are already gathered into the kingdom of Christ, and the nearness of many more throughout the whole land, for the regions are white unto the harvest, doth promise within less than 100 years, if our sins and theirs make, not us and them unworthy of this mercy, a very plenteous harvest justif. Yea, some of us have often heard him say that even those ministers and other godly persons that did then most sharply oppose them, if they might come to be from under the bishops, and live in a place of rest and peace, where they might comfortably subsist, they would practice the same things which they now did. And truly many of us have seen this abundantly verified, not only in these latter times, but formerly. Dr. Ames was estranged from and opposed Mr. Robinson, and yet afterwards there was loving compliance and near agreement between them, and, which is more strange, Mr. Johnson himself, who was afterwards pastor of the Church of God at Amsterdam, was a preacher to the Company of English of the Staple at Middelburg, in Zealand, and had great concern. Only he took up 2 of them, one to keep in his own study, that he might see their errors, and the other to bestow on a special friend for the like use. Tame maintenance allowed him by them, and was highly respected of them, and so zealous against this way as that, when Mr. Barrows and Mr. Greenwood's refutation of Gifford was privately in printing in this city, he not only was a means to discover it, but was made the ambassador's instrument to intercept them at the press, and see them burnt, which charge he did so well perform, as he let them go on until they were wholly finished, and then surprised the whole impression, not suffering any to escape, and then, by the magistrate's authority, caused them all to be openly burnt, himself standing by, until they were all consumed to ashes. But mark the sequel. When he had done this work, he went home, and being set down in his study, he began to turn over some pages of this book, and superficially to read some things here and there, as his fancy led him. At length he met with something that began to work upon his spirit, which so wrought with him as drew him to this resolution, seriously to read over the whole book, the which he did once and again. In the end he was so taken, and his conscience was troubled so, as he could have no rest in himself until he crossed the seas, and came to London to confer with the authors, who were then in prison, and shortly after executed, to be new printed, and set out at his own charge. after which conference he was so satisfied and confirmed in the truth, as he never returned to his place any more at Middleburg, but had joined himself to their society at London, and was afterwards committed to prison, and then banished, and inished, and in a conclusion, coming to live at Amsterdam, he caused the same books which he had been an instrument to burn. And some of us here present testify this to be a true relation, which we heard from his own mouth before many witnesses. Young men, we have seen a book of Mr. Robert Bailey's, a Scotchman, wherein he seemeth to take notice of the spreading of the truth under the notion of error, and casts all the disgraces he can on it, and ranks it with others the foolest errors of a foolest errors of the time, and endeavours to show how like a small spark it revived out of the ashes, and was brow. Tea from Leyden over the seas into New England, and there nourished with much silence until it spread to other places in the country, and by eminent hands from thence into Old England. Lay in any measure they desire, he only may have the glory. Ancient men. As we dare say, Mr. Bailey intends no honour to the persons by what he says, either to those here or from whence they came, so are they far from seeking any to themselves, but rather are ashamed that their weak working hath brought more glory to God, and if in anything God hath made any of them instruments for the good of his people. Ale was leavened. Answer to Mr. Bailey, page 17. And whereas Mr. Bailey affirmeth that, however it was, in a few years, the most who settled in the land did agree to model themselves after Mr. Robinson's pattern, we agree with Reverend Mr. Cotton that there was no agreement by any solemn or common consultation, but that it is true they did, as if they had agreed, by the same spirit of truth and unity, set up, by the help of Christ, the same model of churches, one like to another, and if they at Plymouth have helped any of the first comers in their theory, by hearing and discerning their practices, therein and the Scripture is fulfilled, that the kingdom of heaven is like unto leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal until early. Young men, we desire to know how many have been put to death for this cause, and what manner of persons they were, and what occasions were taken against them by bringing them to their end. These 2 last mentioned were condemned by cruel Judge Popham, whose countenance and carriage was very rough and severe toward them, with many sharp menaces. But God gave them courage to bear it, and to make this answer, My Lord, your face we fear not, and for your threats we care not, and to come to your reed service we dare not. These 2 last named were put to death for dispersing of books. Ancient men. We know certainly of 6 that were publicly executed, besides such as died in prisons, Mr. Henry Barrow, Mr. Greenwood. These suffered at Tyburn, Mr. Penry at St. Thomas Waterings, by London, Mr. William Dennis at Thetford in Norfolk, 2 others at St. Edmunds in Suffolk, whose names were Copping and Elias Thacker. For Mr. Dennis, he was a godly man and faithful in his place, but what occasion was taken against him, we know not more than the common cause. Young. For Mr. Penry, how unjustly he was charged, himself hath made manifest to the world in his books, and that declaration which he made a little before his suffering, all which are extant in print with some of his godly letters. As for Mr. Barrow and Mr. Greenwood, it also appears by their own writings how those statutes formerly made against the Papists were wrested against them, and they condemned thereupon, as may be seen by their examinations. Men, but these were rigid Brownists, and lie under much aspersion, and their names much blemished and beclouded, not only by enemies, but even by godly and very reverend men. H. written in a late book in these stirring times. Ancient men, they can no more justly be called Brownists than the disciples might have been called Judasites. For they did as much abhor Brown's apostasy and profane course, and his defection, as the disciples and other Christians did Judas' treachery, and for their rigid and roughness of spirit, as some of them, especially Mr. Barrow, is taxed. It may be considered they were very rigidly and roughly dealt with, not only by the Lord's enemies and their enemies, but by some godly persons of those times, differing in opinions from them, which makes some of us call to mind what one Dr. Taylor had, uffers without cause. Such an eminent man, saith he, hath had the good hap to be reputed orthodox by posterity, and did condemn such a man of such an opinion, and yet himself erred in as considerable matters. More charitable posterity after his death hath his memory preserved in honour, and the adder's name slain, of which he gives instances in his book entitled The Liberty of Prophesying, page 33 and following. Answer to Mr. Bernard, folio 84. Was guided to write in those phrases. I dare not censure him as you do, especially considering with what fiery zeal the Lord hath furnished such his servants at all times, as he hath stirred up for special reformation. We refer you to Mr. Robinson's answer to Mr. Bernard, where he charges him with blasphemy, railing, scoffing. See all, Mr. Barrow, saith Mr. Robinson, as I say with Mr. Ainsworth, that I will not justify all the word of man, nor yet mine eye, nor I swear in it. Oh, and so say I also with Mr. Smith, that because I know not by what particular motion of the Spirit he, let the example of Luther alone suffice, whom into what terms his zeal carried, his writings testify. And yet both in him and in Mr. Barrow there might be, with true spiritual zeal, fleshly indignation mingled. And so no one term given by Mr. Barrow, but may, at the least, be tolerated. Ch. by play would boast of loose spending it with courtesans. See. And further in page 86 he saith, that such harsh terms, wherewith he entertains such persons and things in the church as carry with them most appearance of holiness, they are to be interpreted according to his meaning, with this distinction, that Mr. Barrow speaks not of these persons and things simply, but in a respect, and so considered. Young men. But divers reverend men have expressed concerning this matter, that God is not wont to make choice of men infamous for gross sins and vices before their calling, to make them any instruments of reformation after their calling, and proceed to declare that Mr. Barrow was a great gamester, and a dicer when he lived in court, and getting moo, ancient men. Truly, with due respect to such reverend men be it spoken, those things might well have been spared from putting in print, especially so long after his death, when not only he, but all his friends are taken out of the world, that might vindicate his name. Was not the Apostle Paul a persecutor of God's saints unto death? That he was tainted with vices at the court before his conversion, and calling, it is not very strange, and if he had lived and died in that condition, it is like he might have gone out of the world without any public brand on his name, and his name, passed for a tolerable Christian and member of the church. He had hurt enough done him, whilst he lived, by evil and cruel enemies. Why should godly men be prejudicated to him after his death in his name? And if histories deceive us not, was not Cyprian a magician before his conversion? And Augustine a Manichaean? And doth not the same apostle, speaking of scandalous and lascivious persons, say, and such were some of you, but ye are washed, but ye are sanctified, but ye are justified in the name of the Lord Jesus, and by the Spirit of our God, by which it may seem that if God do not make choice of such men as have been infamous for gross vices before their calling, yet sometimes he is wont to do it, and is free to choose whom he pleaseth for notable instruments for his own work. And when it was said unto him in the voice he heard, Tolle et lege, he was directed to that place of Scripture, not in gluttony and drunkenness, nor in chambering and wantonness, nor in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and take no thought for the flesh to fulfill the lusts of it. As for other things that have been spoken of him, and Mr. Greenwood and Mr. Penry, we leave them as they are, but some of us have reason to think there are some mistakes in the relations of those things. Only we shall add other public testimonies concerning them from witnesses of very worthy credit, which are also in print. First, from Mr. Phillips, a famous and godly preacher, having heard and seen Mr. Barrow's holy speeches and preparations for death, said, Barrow, Barrow, my soul be with thine, as allegiance to speak. The same author also reports that Queen Elizabeth asked learned Dr. Reynolds what he thought of those two men, Mr. Barrow and Mr. Greenwood, and he answered Her Majesty that it could not avail anything to show his judgment concerning them, seeing they were put to death, and being loath to speak his mind further, Her Majesty charged him upon it. Whereupon he answered that he was persuaded, if they had lived, they would have been two as worthy instruments for the Church of God as have been raised up in this age. Her Majesty sighed, and said no more. But after that, riding to a park by the place where they were executed, and being willing to take further information concerning them, demanded of the Right Honourable the Earl of Cumberland, that was present when they suffered, what end they made. He answered, "A very godly end, and prayed for your Majesty and the state ceasing." We may also add what some of us have heard by credible information, that the Queen demanded of the Archbishop what he thought of them in his conscience. He answered, he thought they were the servants of God, but dangerous to the state. "Alas," said she, "shall we put the servants of God to death?" And this was the true cause why no more of them were put to death in her days. Young men, did any of you know Mr. Barrow, if we may be so bold to ask? For we would willingly know what was his life and conversation, because some, we perceive, have him in precious esteem, and others can scarce name him without some note of obloquy and dislike. We have heard his conversion to be on this wise. He was a gentleman of good worth, and a flourishing courtier in his time, and, as appears in his own answers to the Archbishop and Dr. Cousins, he was sometime a student at Cambridge, and Inns of Court, and accomplished with strong parts. Ancient men. We have not seen his person, but some of us have been well acquainted with those that knew him familiarly both before and after his conversion, and one of us hath had conference with one that was his domestic servant, and tened upon him both before and some while after the same. Walking in London one Lord's day with one of his companions, he heard a preacher at his sermon very loud, as they passed by the church. Upon which Mr. Barrow said unto his consort, "Let us go in, and hear what this man saith that is thus earnest." "Tush," said the other, "what, shall we go to hear a man talk? See." But in he went, and sat down. Some time in the city, giving himself to study and reading of the Scriptures, and other good works, very diligently. And being missed at court by his consorts and acquaintance, it was quickly bruited abroad that Barrow was turned Puritan, and the minister was vehement in reproving sin, and sharply applied the judgments of God against the same, and, it should seem, touched him to the quick in such things as he was guilty of, so as God set it home to his soul, and began to work his soul, and began to work his repentance and conversion thereby. For he was so stricken as he could not be quiet, until by conference with godly men, and further hearing of the word, with diligent reading and meditation, God brought peace to his soul and conscience, after much humiliation of heart and reformation of life. So as he left the court, and retired himself to a private life, sometime in the country, and what his course was afterwards, his writings show, as also his sufferings and conference with men of all sorts do declare, until his life was taken from him. Young men, we thank you for your pains. Yea, and that which some will hardly believe, he did much persuade them to peace, and composed many differences that were grown amongst them whilst he lived, and would have, it is like, prevented more that after fell out, if he had continued. And thus much we can further affirm, from those that well knew him, that he was very comfortable to the poor, and those in distress in their sufferings. And when he saw he must die, he gave a stock for the relief of the poor of the church, which was a good help to them in their banished condition afterwards. We hope it will extend further than our satisfaction. We cannot but marvel that such a man should be by so many aspersed, within those times, who out of fear or weakness did not come so close up to the truth in their practice as their doctrines and grounds seem to hold forth, which makes us remember what was the answer of Erasmus to the Duke of Saxony, when he asked his opinion whether Luther had erred. Ancient men. It is not much to be marvelled at, for he was most plain in discovering the cruelty, fraud, and hypocrisy of the enemies of the truth, and searching into the corruptions of the time, which made him abhorred of them, and peradventure something too harsh against the haltings of divers of the preachers and professors that he had to debt. He answered, his opinions were good, but wished he would moderate his style, which stirred him up the more enemies, no doubt. Oh, them, in their sufferings, but a minority. And then they go on and say, what a compulsory banishment has been put upon those blessed and glorious lights, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Parker, A.M.C., young men. We find in the writings of some such, who were very eminent in their times for piety and learning, that those of the separation found more favour in our native country than those who were reproached by the name of Puritans, and after much discourse thereabouts come to this conclusion, that no comparison will hold from the separatists' tea, ancient men. Far be it from any of us to detract from or to extenuate the sufferings of any of the servants of God, much less from those worthies forenamed, or any others afterwards mentioned. Yet under favour we crave pardon if we cannot consent to the judgment of such eminent ones for piety and learning above hinted. But we shall give you some instances, and leave it to you and some others to consider of. 1. We doubt not, but do easily grant, that the sufferings of those reproached by the name of Puritans were great, especially some of them, and were better known to those pious and learned men first above intimated, than the sufferings of those that are the sufferings of those that are reproached by the name of Brownists and Separatists. Though no more were publicly executed, yet sundry more were condemned, and brought to the gallows, and ascended the ladder, not knowing but they should die, and have been reprieved, and after banished, some of which we have known, and often spoken with. 2. Others have not only been forced into voluntary banishment by great numbers, to avoid further cruelty, but divers, after long and sore imprisonment, have been forced to abjure the land by oath, never to return without leave, saith. In anno 1604, persons at once were forced to do so at a public sessions in London, or else upon refusal they were to be hanged. This their abjuration was done on the statute of the 35 of Queen Elizabeth. Some of these we also known. 4. We find mention in a printed book of 17 or 18 that have died in several prisons in London in 6 years' time before the year 1592, besides what have been in other parts of the land, and since that time, perishing by cold, hunger, or noisomeness of the prison. If we deserve death, it beseemeth the majesty of justice not to see us closely murdered, yea, starved to death with hunger and cold, and stifled in loathsome dungeons. As they complain that no felons, traitors, nor murderers in the land were thus dealt with. And so, after many other grievous complaints, conclude with these words, We crave for all of us but the liberty either to die openly, or to live openly in the die openly in the land of our nativity. In the same year we find a lamentable petition, now in print, of 60 persons committed unbailable to several prisons in London, as Newgate, the Gatehouse, Clink, C, being made close prisoners, allowing them neither meat, drink, suffering any whose hearts the Lord would stir up for their relief to have any access unto them. So, if we be guiltless, we crave but the benefit of our innocence, viz., have suffered, that we may have peace to serve our God and our Prince in the place of the sepulchres of our fathers. Suppose there were but few of them ministers that suffered, as above expressed, yet their sorrows might be as great, and their wants more, and their souls as much afflicted, because more contemned and neglected of men. And what numbers since those who have been put unto compulsory banishment and other hard sufferings, as loss of goods, friends, and long and hard imprisonments, under which many have died, it is so well known that it would make up a volume to rehearse them, and would not only equalize, but far exceed the number of those godly called Puritans. But some have said they were excommunicated, and that was no great matter, as excommunications went in those days. So were these, not only while they were living, but some of them many times after they were dead. And, as some of the other were imprisoned, so were more of these. But it is further said, all of them were deprived of their ministry, and so were these of their livelihood and maintenance, although they had no offices to lose. And they perished in prisons, and these poor creatures endured, many of them, such hardships as is well known to some of us, as makes our hearts still ache to remember. But those remained still in the land, and were succoured and sheltered by good people in a competent wise, the most of them, and sundry of them lived as well, as may easily be proved, if not better, than if they had enjoyed their benefices, whereas the other were, a great number of them, forced to fly into foreign lands for shelter, or else might a shelter. We, some of us, knew Mr. Parker, Dr. Ames, and Mr. Jacob in Holland, when they sojourned for a time in Ireland, and all three boarded together, and had their victuals dressed by some of our acquaintance, and then they lived comfortable, and then they lived comfortable, and then they lived comfortable, were provided for, as became their persons. And after Mr. Jacob returned, and Mr. Parker was at Amsterdam, where he printed some of his books, and Mr. Ames disposed of himself to other places, it was not worse with him, and some of us well know how it fared then with many precious Christians, in divers times and places. To speak the truth, the professors in England, though many of them suffered much at the hands of the prelates, yet they had a great advantage of the separatists, for the separatists had not only the prelates and their faction to encounter with, and what hard measure they met with at their hands, above the other, doth sufficiently appear by what is countenanced to the other, before declared, but also they must endure the frowns, and many times the sharp invectives, of the forward ministers against them, both in public and private, and what influence they had upon the spirits of the people is well enough known also by I also. Reason hereof, the ministers in foreign countries did look awry at them when they would give help, and note, young men. Indeed, it seems they have sometimes suffered much hardness in the Low Countries, if that be true that is reported of such a man as Mr. Ainsworth, that he should live for some time with 9d. a week, to which is replied by another, that if people suffered him to live on 9d. a week, with roots boiled, either the people were grown extreme low in estate, or the growth of their godliness was come to a very low ebb. Ancient men. The truth is, their condition for the most part was for some time very low and hard, and no marvel. It was with them as, if it should be related, would hardly be believed. For many of them had lain long in prisons, and then were banished into Newfoundland, where they were abused, and at last came into the Low Countries, and, wanting money, trades, friends, or acquaintances, and languages to help themselves, how could it be otherwise? Was married afterwards. He and his family were comfortably provided for. The report of Mr. Ainsworth was near those times, when he was newly come out of Ireland with others poor, and being a single young man and very studious, was content with a little, and yet, to take off the aspersion from the people in that particular, the chief and true reason thereof is mistaken. For he was a very modest and bashful man, and concealed his wants from others, until some suspected how it was with him, and pressed him to see how it was, and after it was known, such as were able mended his condition, and when he— But we have said enough of these things. Young men, was that Brown that fell away and made apostasy the first inventor and beginner of this way? They had few friends to comfort them, nor any arm of flesh to support them, and if in some things they were too rigid, they are rather to be pitied, considering their times of sufferings, than to be blasted with reproach to posterity. Moreover, many of the martyrs, both former and latter, have maintained it, as is to be seen in the acts and monuments of the Church. Had Coles before Mr. Brown wrote for it? Ancient men. No, verily, for as one answers this question very well in a printed book, almost 40 years ago that the prophets, apostles, and evangelists have in their authentic writings laid down the ground thereof, and upon that ground is their authentic writings, and building reared up and surely settled. Also, in the days of Queen Elizabeth there was a separated church, whereof Mr. Fitz was pastor, and another before that in the time of Queen Mary, of which Mr. Ruff was pastor or teacher, Cuthbert Simpson a deacon, who exercised amongst their pastorasses themselves as other ordinances, so church censures as excommunication, etc., and professed and practised Dale. But he being one that afterwards wrote for it, they that first hatched the name of Puritans, and bestowed it on the godly professors that desired reformation, they likewise, out of the same storehouse, would needs bestow this new livery upon others that never would own it, nor had reason so to do. Divers other instances might be given. Mr. Cotton likewise, in his answer to Mr. Bailey, page 4, shows how in the year 1567 there were 100 persons who refused the common liturgy, and the congregations attending their unto, and used prayers and preaching and the sacramency amongst themselves, whereof 14 or 15 were sent to prison, of whom the chiefest were Mr. Smith, Mr. Nixon, James Ireland, Robert Hawkins, Thomas Rowland, and Richard Moorcroft. And these pleaded their separation before the Lord Mayor, Bishop Sands, and other commissioners on June 20th, 1567, about 80 years ago, being 80 years ago, being many years before Brown. Young men. But if we mistake not, Mr. Brown is accounted by some of good note to be the inventor of that way which is called Brownism, from whom the sect took its name. Ancient men. Possibly this speech might arise from a common received opinion. Moreover, it is said by such of note as aforesaid, that it is not God's usual manner of dealing to leave any of the first publishers, or restorers of any truth of his, to such fearful apostasy, paration to formality, and from thence to profaneness, instruments unto them, though Brown may sometimes have professed some of the same things, and now fallen from the same, as many others have done. But Reverend Mr. Cotton, in his answer to Mr. Bailey, saith, the backsliding of Brown from that way of separation is a just reason why the separatists may disclaim denomination from him, and refuse to be called Brownists after his name, and to speak, and his name, with reason, saith he, if any be justly to be called Brownists, it is only such as revolt from sesh, page 5, to which we may add that it is very injurious to call those after his name, whose person they never knew, and whose writings few, if any of them, ever saw, and whose errors and backslidings they have constantly borne witness against, and what truths they have received have been from the light of God's sacred word, conveyed by other godly eye. T.F., Mr. John Smith, Mr. John Robinson, Mr. Richard Clifton. No, young men, seeing we have presumed thus far to inquire into these ancient times of you, and of the sufferings of the aforesaid persons, we would likewise entreat you, though never so briefly, to tell us something of the persons and carriages of us, other eminent men about those times, or immediately after, as Mr. Francis Johnson, Mr. Henry Ainsworth. Ancient men. Here are some in the company that knew them all familiarly, whom we shall desire to satisfy your request. We shall therefore speak of them in order briefly. Mr. Johnson, of whom something was spoken before, was pastor of the Church of God at Amsterdam. Those answered, we shall do it most willingly, for we cannot but honour the memory of the men for the good that not only many others, but we ourselves have received by them at their ministry. For we have heard them all, and lived under the mystery of divers of them for some years. A very grave man he was, and an able teacher, and was the most solemn in all his administrations that we have seen any, and especially in dispensing the seals of the covenant, both baptism and the Lord's Supper. And a good disputant he was. We heard Mr. Smith upon occasion say that he was persuaded no men living were able to maintain a cause against those two men, meaning Mr. Johnson and Mr. Ainsworth, if they had not the truth on their side. But he lived not many years after, and died at Amsterdam after his return from Emden. He, by reason of many dissensions that fell out in the church, and the subtlety of one of the elders of the same, came after many years to alter his judgment about the government of the church, and his practice thereupon, which caused a division amongst them. Young men, but he is much spoken against for excommunicating his brother and his own father, and maintaining his wife's cause, who was by his brother and others reproved for her pride in apparel. Ancient men. Himself hath often made his own defence, and others for him. In our time his wife was a grave matron, and very modest both in her apparel and all her demeanour, ready to any good works in her place, and helpful to many, especially the poor, and an ornament to his calling. The church did, after long patience towards them, and much pains taken with them, excommunicate them for their unreasonable and endless opposition, and such things as did accompany the same, and such was the justice thereof, as he could not but consent thereto, cork shoes, and other such like things as the citizens of her rank then used to wear. She was a young widow when he married her, and had been a merchant's wife, by whom he had a good estate, and was a godly woman. And because she wore such apparel as she had been formerly used to, which were neither excessive nor immodest, for their chiefest exceptions were against her wearing of some whalebone in the bodice and sleeves of her gown, we shall, for brevity's sake, only show one. Such was the strictness, or rigidness, as now the term goes, of some in those times, as we can by experience and of our own knowledge show in other instances. And, although For offence sake, she and he were willing to reform the fashions of them, so far as might be without spoiling of their garments, yet it would not content them, except they came full up to their size. We were in the company of a godly man that had been a long time prisoner at Norwich for this cause, and was by Judge Cook set at liberty. She, knowing his voice, made him very welcome, and those with him. After going into the country, he visited his friends, and returning that way again, to go into the Low Countries by ship at Yarmouth, and so desired some of us to turn in with him to the house of an ancient woman in the city, who had been very kind and helpful to him in his sufferings. Yet the man was a plain countryman, clad in grey russet, without either welt or guard, as the proverb is, and the band he wore scarce worth 3d, made of their own home spinning, and he was godly and humble as he was plain. But after some time of their entertainment, being ready to depart, she came up to him, and felt of his band, for her eyes were dim with age, and perceiving it was something stiffened with starch, she was much displeased, and reproved him very sharply, fearing God would not prosper his journey. What would such professors, if they were now living, say to the excess of our times? Mr. Henry Ainsworth, a man of 1,000, was teacher of this church at Amsterdam at the same time when Mr. Johnson was pastor. 2 worthy men they were, and of excellent parts. He continued constant in his judgment and practice unto his end in those things about the church government, from which Mr. Johnson swerved and fell. He ever maintained good correspondence with Mr. Robinson at Leyden, and would consult with him in all matters of weight, both in their differences and afterwards. A very learned man he was, and a close student, which much impaired his health. We have heard some, eminent in the knowledge of the tongues, of the University of Leyden, say that they thought he had not his better for the Hebrew tongue in the University, nor scarce in Europe. He was a man very modest, amiable, and sociable in his ordinary course and carriage, of an innocent and unblameable life and conversation, of a meek spirit and a calm temper, void of passion and not easily provoked. He had an excellent gift of teaching and opening the Scriptures, and things did flow from him with that facility, plainness, and sweetness, as did much affect the hearers. And yet he would be something smart in his style to his opposers in his public writings, at which we that have seen his constant carriage, both in public disputes and the managing of all church affairs, and such like occurrences, have sometimes marvelled. In a word, in the citing of any place, teaching not only the word and doctrine of God, but in the words of God, and, for the most part, in a continued phrase and words of Scripture. He was powerful and profound in doctrine, although his voice was not strong, and had this excellency above many, that he was most ready and pregnant in the Scriptures, as if the book of God had been written in his heart. Being as ready in his heart, quotations, without tossing and turning his book, as if they had lain open before his eyes, and seldom misadded. He used great dexterity, and was ready in comparing Scripture with Scripture, one with another. In a word, the times and place in which he lived were not worthy of such a man. Young wants men, but we find that he is taxed, in a book writ by George Johnson, with apostasy, and to be a man-pleaser, etc. Ancient men. Who can escape the scourge of tongues? Christ himself could not do it when he was here upon earth, although there was no guile found in his mouth, nor Moses, although he was the meekest man in the earth. For man-pleasing, they that tax him do it, because he concurred against their violent and endless dissensions about the former matters. And for his apostasy, this was all the matter. And truly herein they may worthily bear the name of rigid, etc. Mr. John Smith was an eminent man in his time, and a good preacher, and of other good parts, but his inconstancy and unstable judgment, and being so suddenly carried away with things, did soon overthrow him. When he was a young man, before he came out of England, he, at the persuasion of some of his godly friends, went once or twice to hear a godly minister preach, and this was the great matter of apostasy, for which those violent men thought him worthy to win or pay, be deposed from his place, and for which they thus charge him. Yet we have some of us heard him use this speech. Truly, said he, we being now come into a place of liberty, are in great danger, if we look not well to our ways, for we are like men set upon the ice, and therefore may easily slide and fall. But in this example it appears it is an easier matter to give good counsel than to follow it, to foresee danger than to prevent it, which made the prophet to say, O Lord, the way of man is not in himself, neither is it in man to walk and to direct his steps. He was sometime pastor to a company of honest and godly men, which came with him out of England, and pitched at Amsterdam. He first fell into some errors about the Scriptures, and so into some opposition with Mr. Johnson, who had been his tutor, and the church there. But he was convinced of them by the pains and faithfulness of Mr. Johnson and Mr. Ainsworth, and revoked them. But afterwards was drawn away some of the Dutch Anabaptists, who, finding him to be a good scholar and unsettled, they easily misled thee. Most of his people, and other of them scattered away. His and his people's condition may be an object of pity for after times. He lived not many years after, but died there of a consumption, to which he was inclined before he came out of England. Mr. John Robinson was pastor of that famous church of Leyden in Holland, a man not easily to be paralleled for all things, whose singular virtues we shall not take upon us here to describe. Neither need we, for they so well are known, both by friends and enemies. He was very courteous, affable, and sociable in his conversation, and towards his own people especially. As he was a man learned and of solid judgment, and of a quick and sharp wit, so was he also of a tender conscience, and very sincere in all his ways, a hater of hypocrisy and dissimulation, and would be very plain with his best friends. He was an acute and expert disputant, very quick and ready, and had much bickering with the Arminians, who stood more in fear of him than any of the university. Able, learned, and holy the persons were, the more he desired to confer and reason with them. He was very profitable in his ministry, and comfortable to his people. He was much beloved of them, and as loving was he unto them, and entirely sought their good for soul and body. He was never satisfied in himself until he had searched any cause or argument he had to deal in thoroughly and to the bottom. And we have heard him sometimes say to his familiars that many times, both in writing and disputation, he knew he had sufficiently answered others, but many times not himself, and was ever desirous of any light, and the more. In a word, he was much esteemed and reverenced of all that knew him, and his abilities were acknowledged both of friends and strangers. But we resolved to be brief in this matter, leaving you to better and more large information herein from others. But it was his lot, and he bore it patiently. Mr. Richard Clifton was a grave and fatherly old man when he came first into Holland, having a great white beard, and pity it was that such a reverend old man should be forced to leave his country, and at those years to go into exile. Sound and orthodox he always was, and so continued to his end. Much good had he done in the country where he lived, and converted many to God by his faithful and painful ministry, both in preaching and catechizing. Thus have we briefly satisfied your desire. He belonged to the church at Leyden, but being settled at Amsterdam, and thus aged, he was loath to remove any more. And so, when they removed, he was dismissed to them there, and remained, he was dismissed to them there, and remained till he died. Young men, we are very thankful to you for your pains. We perceive God raiseth up excellent instruments in all ages to carry on his own work, and the best of men have their failings sometimes, as we see in these our times, and that there is no new thing under the sun. But before we end this matter, we desire you would say something of those two churches that were so long in exile, of whose guides we have already heard. Now, ancient men. Truly there were in them many worthy men, and if you had seen them in their beauty and ardour, as we have done, you would have been much affected therewith, we dare say. Years of age, when she was chosen, she honoured her place, and was an ornament to the congregation. At Amsterdam, before their division and breach, there were about 300 communicants, and they had for their pastor and teacher those two eminent men before named, and in our time 4 grave men, ruling elders, and 3 able and honored godly men. For deacons, 1 ancient widow for a deaconess, who did them service many years, though she was 60-odd. She usually sat in a convenient place in the congregation, with a little birchen rod in her hand, and kept little children in great awe from disturbing the congregation. Christ, She did frequently visit the sick and weak, especially women, and, as there was need, called out maids and young women to watch and do them other helps as their necessity did require. And if they were poor, she would gather relief for them of those, and that were able, or acquaint deacons, and she was obeyed as a mother in Israel and an officer of sea. And what their condition hath been since, some of you that are of their children do see, and can tell. And that which was a crown unto them, they lived together in love and peace all their days, without any considerable differences, or any disturbance that grew thereby, but such as was easily healed in love. And so they continued, until consent they removed into New England. And for the church of Leyden, they were sometimes not much fewer in number, nor at all inferior in able men, though they had not so many officers as the other. For they had but one ruling elder with their pastor, a man well approved, and of great age, and integrity. Also, they had 3 able men for deacons, young men. If we may not be tedious, we would request to know one thing more. Many worthy and able men there were in both places, who lived and died in obscurity in respect of the world, as private Christians, yet were they precious in the eyes of the Lord, and also in the eyes of such as knew them, whose virtues we with such as knew them, whose virtues we with such of you, as are their children, do follow and imitate. It is commonly said that those of a separation hold none to be true churches but their own, and condemn all the churches in the world besides, which lieth as a foul blot upon them, yea, even on some here in New England, except they can remove it. Ancient men. It is a manifest slander laid upon them, for they hold all the Reformed churches to be true churches, and even the most rigid of them have ever done so, as appears by their apologies and other writings, and we ourselves some of us know writings, and we ourselves some of us know of much intercommunion that divers have held with them reciprocally, not only with the Dutch and French, but even with the Scotch, who are not of the best mould, yea, and with the Lutherans also. And we believe they have gone as far herein, both in judgment and practice, as any of the churches in New England do or can do, to deal faithfully and while I bear witness against their corruptions. Having thus far satisfied all your demands, we shall here break off this conference for this time, desiring the Lord to make you to grow up in grace and wisdom, and the true fear of God, that in all faithfulness and humility you may serve him in your faithfulness and humility. You may serve him in your generations. I, young men, gentlemen, we humbly thank you for your pains with us, and respect unto us, and do further crave that, upon any fit occasions, we may have access unto you for any further information, and herewith do humbly take our leave. The Pilgrims' arrival at Cape Cod, nor satisfied from Bradford's History. Being thus arrived in a good harbour, and brought safe to land, they fell upon their knees, blessed ye God of heaven, who had brought them over ye vast furious ocean, and delivered them from all ye perils, miseries thereof, again to set their feet on ye firm and stable earth, their proper element. But here I cannot but stay and make a pause, and stand half a mast at this poor people's presente condition. And so I think will the reader too, when he well considers ye same, and no marvel if they were thus joyful, seeing wise Seneca was so affected with sailing a few miles on ye coast of his own Italy, as he affirmed that he had rather remain 20 years on his way by land, than pass by sea to any place in a short time, so tedious dreadful was ye same unto him. Being thus past ye vast ocean, and a sea of troubles before, in their preparation, as may be remembered by it, which went before, they had now no friends to welcome them, nor inns to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies, no houses, or much to entertain or refresh their weather-beaten bodies. Now this is less towns to repair to seek for succour. It is recorded in Scripture as a mercy to ye apostle his shipwrecked company. It, the barbarians, showed them no small kindness in refreshing them, but these savage barbarians, when they met with them as after will appear, were readier to fill their readier. sides full of arrows than otherwise. And for ye season it was winter, and they that know ye winters of yite country know them to be sharp violent, subject to cruel fierce storms, dangerous to travel to known places, much more to search an unknown coast. And what multitudes there might be of them they knew not. Besides, what could they see but a hideous desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts, wild men? If it be said they had a ship to succour them, it is true. But what heard they daily from ye, Mr. Company? Never could they, as it were, go up to ye tope of Pisgah, to view from this wilderness a more goodly country to feed their hops, for which way, soever they turn their eyes, save upward to ye heavens, they could have little solace or content in respect of any outward objects. For sooner being done, all things stand upon them with a weather-beaten face, and ye whole country, full of woods thickets, represented a wild savage hayou. If they looked behind them, there was the mighty ocean which they had passed, and was now as a main bar gulf to separate them from all ye civil parts of ye world. As their return, yea, it was muttered by some, that if they got not a place in time, they would turn them their goods ashore, leave them. Let it also be considered what weak hopes of supply succour they left behind them. Yite might bear up their minds in this said condition, and trials they were under, and they could not but be very smale. But yite with speed they should look out a place with their shallop, where they would be at some near distance. For ye season was such, as he would not stir from thence till a safe harbour was discovered by them, where they would be, and he might go, without danger, and that victuals consumed apace, that he must would keep sufficient for themselves. What could now sustain them, but ye Spirit of God, his grace? Ought not the children of these fathers rightly say? It is true indeed, ye affections' love of their brethren at Leyden was cordial entire towards them, but they had little power to help them, or themselves, and how ye case stowed between them, ye marchants, at their coming away, hath already been marchants, at their coming away, hath already been declared. Our fathers were Englishmen which came over this great ocean, and were ready to perish in this wilderness. But they cried unto ye Lord, and he heard their voice, and looked on their adversity. See, let them therefore praise ye Lord, because he is good, his mercies endure for ever. Yea, let them which have been redeemed of ye Lord show how he hath delivered them from ye hand of ye oppressor. Let them confess before ye Lord his loving kindness, and his wonderful works before ye sons of men. When they wandered in ye deserta wilderness out of ye way, and found no city to dwell in, both hungry, thirsty, their soul was overwhelmed in them. That no other person understood so well the history of the Plymouth Colony. While yet a youth, he became a member of Brewster's little congregation at Scrooby, near by, and in 1608 he escaped with the others to Holland, and became a leading member of the church at Leyden, taking an active part in the removal to New England in 1620. William Bradford, the great governor of the Plymouth Colony, was born at Austerfield, a little village in Yorkshire, in 1588, the same year, the year of the Spanish Armada, that John Winthrop, the great governor of the fate governor of the Massachusetts colony, was born at Groton in Suffolk. Upon Carver's death in 1621, he was elected to succeed him as governor, and he continued to hold this office with 2 slight breaks to the time of his death in 1657. The remarkable story of the loss of the Nisnek. It is therefore singularly fortunate that he became the colony's historian, as similarly Gov. Winthrop became the historian of the Massachusetts colony. His History of the Plymouth Plantation may properly be called our New England Old Testament, the Genesis, Exodus, Joshua, and Judges of the Plymouth settlement. From the old South Meeting House, where it was preserved in the Prince Library at the time of the British evacuation of Boston, and its discovery in the Bishop of London's library at Fulham in 1855, has been told by Charles Dean in his Introduction to the volume published by the Massachusetts Historical Society, and in the P. Proceedings of the Society, 1855 and 1882. Also, more fully, by Justin Windsor, in the Proceedings for 1882. Bradford's letter book, containing copies of important letters addressed to him, was lost, like his history. It is an interesting fact that the 3rd volume of Winthrop's history long lost, was found in 1816 in the tower of the Old South Meeting House, where, like Bradford's history, it had been kept in Prince's New England Library. Fragments were rescued in a grocer's shop in Halifax and printed in the Mass. Hist, Soak, Dotty, Noy, collections for Freed, and in Young's Chronicles of the in Vol. Collections may be found his Account of New England in verse. His Word to Boston and Word to New England appear in Vol. 37. A little piece called Epitaphium Meum was printed by Morton in his memorial of the same, and two others of his poems in the Proceedings for 1870, Some Observations of God's Merciful Dealings with Us in this Wilderness, and A Word to New Plymouth. Bradford's letters to Winthrop are printed in the Mass. Hist, Soak, Dotty. Collections, 4th series, Volderlitz Hits, Soak, Dotty. In conjunction with Edward Winslow, Bradford wrote A Diary of Occurrences, covering the first year of the colony, which may be found in the Mass. Hist. Collections, 8, and Leipzig, Concert. Bradford's first dialogue, given in the present leaflet, was first printed in 1648. It was copied by Morton in the records of the Plymouth Church, and thence reprinted by Young in his Chronicles of the Pilgrim Fathers in 1841. It is of the highest historical value, giving fuller accounts than we have elsewhere of many of the first English independents. Bradford's second dialogue is lost. Dean says, I have never seen it, nor any reference to it. Sos.in. The third dialogue, concerning the Church and the government thereof, was published in the Proceedings of the Mass, Hist, for 1870, with an important historical introduction by Charles Dean. Mather included a biography of Bradford in his Magnalia.8. This was reprinted in the first series of Old South leaflets. Footnotes. One that is, the dialogue was held or written in 1648. 2 here, something seems to have been omitted. 3 some word is here omitted. Transcribers notes the year on page 24. Born at Austerfield, a little village in Yorkshire, in 1688 was corrected to 1588. Italics are represented thus italic, superscripts thus yin. End of the project. Gutenberg e-book. Governor Bradford's first dialogue, updated editions, will replace the previous one. Creating the works from print editions not protected by U.S. copyright law means that no one owns a United States copyright in these works, so the Foundation and you can copy and distribute it in the United States without permission and without paying copyright royalties. Special rules, set forth in the General Terms of Use part of this license, apply to copying and distributing Project Gutenberg electronic works to protect the Project Gutenberg concept and trademark. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark and may not be used if you charge for an e-book, except by following the terms of the trademark license, including paying royalties for use of the Project Gutenberg trademark. If you do not charge anything for copies of this e-book, complying with the trademark license is very easy. You may use this e-book for nearly any purpose, such as creation of derivative works, reports, performances, and research. Start. Redistribution is subject to the trademark license, especially commercial redistribution. Project Gutenberg e-books may be modified and printed and given away, may do practically anything in the United States, with e-books not protected by U.S. copyright law. E-terms of the full Project Gutenberg license available with this file or online at www.gutenberg.org. Section 1. If you do not agree to abide by all the terms of this agreement, you must cease using and return or destroy all copies of Project Gutenberg electronic works in your possession. Full license, the full Project Gutenberg license. Please read this before you distribute or use this work to protect the Project Gutenberg mission of promoting the free distribution of electronic works. By using or distributing this work or any other work associated in any way with the phrase Project Gutenberg, you agree to comply with all general terms of use and redistributing Project Gutenberg electronic works. 1a. by reading or using any part of this Project Gutenberg electronic work, you indicate that you have read, understand, agree to, and accept all the terms of license, and accept all the terms of this license and intellectual property, trademark, copyright agreement. 1b. Project Gutenberg is a registered trademark. If you paid a fee for obtaining a copy of or access to a Project Gutenberg electronic work, and you do not agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement, you may obtain a refund from the person or entity to whom you paid the fee as set forth in it. Paragraph 1e8. It may only be used on or associated in any way with an electronic work by people who agree to be bound by the terms of this agreement. There are few things that you can do with most Project Gutenberg electronic works, even without complying with the full terms of this agreement. See paragraph 1. See below. See paragraph 1. Here below. 1. See. There are a lot of things you can do with Project Gutenberg electronic works if you follow the terms of this agreement and help preserve free future access to Project Gutenberg electronic works. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the Foundation, or PGLAF, owns a compilation copyright in the collection of Project Gutenberg electronic works. Nearly all the individual works in the collection are in the public domain in the United States. Of course, we hope that you will support the Project Gutenberg mission of promoting free access to electronic works by freely sharing Project Gutenberg works in compliance with the terms of this agreement for keeping the Project Gutenberg name associated with the work. 1d. If an individual work is unprotected by copyright law in the United States, and you are located in the United States, we do not claim a right to prevent you from copying, distributing, performing, displaying, or creating derivative works based on work as long as all references to Project Gutenberg are removed. You can easily comply with the terms of this agreement by keeping this work in the same format, with its attached full Project Gutenberg license when you share it without charge with others. The copyright laws of the place where you are located also govern what you can do with this work. Copyright laws in most countries are in a constant state of change. The Foundation makes no representations concerning the copyright status of any work in any country other than the United States. If you are outside the United States, check the laws of your country in addition to the terms of this agreement before downloading, copying, displaying, performing, distributing, or creating derivative works based on this work or any other Project Gutenberg work. Sum 1E1. 1E, unless you have removed all references to Project Gutenberg. D, or distributed. This e-book is for the use of anyone anywhere in the United States and most other parts of the world at no cost and with almost no restrictions whatsoever. You may copy it, give it away, or reuse it under the terms of the Project Gutenberg license included with this e-book or online at www.gutenberg.org. If you are not located in the United States, you will have to check the laws of the country where you are located before using this e-book. 1E2. The following sentence, with active links to or other immediate access to, the full Project Gutenberg license must appear prominently whenever any copy of a Project Gutenberg any work on which the phrase Project Gutenberg appears, or with where has, which the phrase Project Gutenberg is associated, is accessed, displayed, performed, viewed, copy. 1E3. If an individual Project Gutenberg electronic work is derived from texts not protected by U.S. copyright law, does not contain a notice indicating that it is posted with permission of the copyright holder, the work can be copied and the work can be copied and distributed to anyone in the United States without paying any fees or charges. If an individual Project Gutenberg electronic work is posted with the permission of the copyright holder, your use and distribution must comply with both paragraphs 1E1 through 1E7, and additional terms, any additional terms imposed by the copyright holder. If you are redistributing or providing access to a work with the phrase Project Gutenberg associated with or appearing on the work, you must comply either with the requirements of paragraphs 1E1 through 1E7 or obtain permission for A7, or of A7, or obtain permission of the use of the work and the project Gutenberg trademark as set forth in paragraphs 1E8 or 1E9. Additional terms will be linked to the project Gutenberg license for all works posted with the permission of the copyright holder found at the beginning of this work. 1E4, 1E5. Do not unlink or detach or remove the full project Gutenberg license terms from this work, or any files containing a part of this work, or any other work associated with Project Gutenberg. 1E6. Do not copy, display, perform, distribute, or redistribute this electronic work, or any part of this electronic work, without prominently displaying the sentence set forth in paragraph 1, E1, without the active links or immediate access to the full terms of the active links or immediate access to the full terms of the Project Gutenberg license. You may convert to and distribute this work in any binary, compressed, marked up, non-proprietary or proprietary form, including any word processing or hypertext form, or a means of obtaining a copy upon request of the work in its original plain vanilla ASCII or other form. 1E7. Any alternate format must include the full Project Gutenberg license as specified in paragraph 1E1. However, if you provide access to or distribute copies of a Project Gutenberg work in a format other than plain vanilla ASCII or other format used in the official version posted on the official Project Gutenberg website, www.gutenberg.org, you must, at no additional cost, fee, or expense to the user, provide a copy, a means of exporting a copy. Do not charge a fee for access to viewing, displaying, performing, copying, or distributing any Project Gutenberg works, unless you comply with paragraph 1E8 or 1E8 or 1E9. 1E8. The fee is owed to the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, but he has agreed to donate royalties under this paragraph to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. You may charge a reasonable fee for copies of, or providing access to, or distributing Project Gutenberg electronic works, provided that you pay a royalty fee of 20 of the gross profits you derive from the use of Project Gutenberg works, calculated using the method you already use to calculate your applicable taxes. Royalty payments must be paid within 60 days following each date on which you prepare or are legally required to prepare your periodic tax returns. Royalty payments should be clearly marked as such and sent to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation at the address specified in Section 4. Information about donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. You provide a full refund of any money paid by a user who notifies you in writing or by email within 30 days of receipt that she does not agree to the terms of the full Project Gutenberg license. You must require such a user to return or destroy all copies of the works possessed in a physical medium, and discontinue all use of, and all access to other copies of, and all access to other copies of Project Gutenberg works. You provide, in accordance with paragraph 1F3, a full refund of any money paid for a work or a replacement copy if a defect in the electronic work is discovered and reported to you within 90 days of receipt of the work. 1E9. You comply with all other terms of this agreement for free distribution of Project Gutenberg works. Contact the Foundation as set forth in Section 3 below. 1F1F1. If you wish to charge a fee or distribute a Project Gutenberg electronic work or group of works on different terms than are set forth in this agreement, you must obtain permission in writing from the Project Gutenberg Foundation. Fee. Manager of the Project Gutenberg trademark. Project Gutenberg volunteers and employees expend considerable effort to identify, do copyright research on, transcribe, and proofread works not protected by U.S. copyright law in creating the Project Gutenberg collection. Codes that damage or cannot be read by your equipment. Damages, costs, and expenses, including legal fees. Despite these efforts, Project Gutenberg electronic works and the medium on which they may be stored may contain defects, such as but not limited to, incomplete, inaccurate or corrupt data, transcription errors, a copyright or other intellectual errors, a property infringement, a defective or damaged disk or other medium, a computer virus or computer, you agree that you have no remedies for negligence, strict liability, breach of warranty or breach of contract, except those provided in paragraph 1F3. 1F2. Limited warranty, disclaimer of damages, except for the right of replacement or refund, described in paragraph 1F3, the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, the owner of the Project Gutenberg trademark, and any other party distributing. A Project Gutenberg electronic work under this agreement disclaim all liability to you for 1F3. Limited right of replacement or refund. You agree that the Foundation, the trademark owner, and any distributor under this agreement will not be liable to you for actual, direct, indirect, consequential, punitive, or incidental damages, even if you give notice of the possibility of such damage. If you discover a defect in this electronic work within 90 days of receiving it, you can receive a refund of the money, if any you paid for it, by sending a written explanation to the person you received the work from. If you received the work on a physical medium, you must return the medium with your written explanation. The person or entity that provided you with the defective work may elect to provide a replacement copy in lieu of a refund. If you received the work electronically, the person or entity providing it to you may choose to give you a second opportunity to receive the work electronically in lieu of a refund. 1F4. If the second copy is also defective, you may demand a refund in writing without further opportunities to fix the problem. 1F5. Some states do not allow disclaimers of certain implied warranties or the exclusion or limitation of certain types of damages, except for the limited right of replacement or refund set forth in paragraph 1F3. This work is provided to you as is, with no other warranties of any kind, express or implied, including but not limited to warranties of merchantability or fitness, for any purpose. If any disclaimer or limitation set forth in this agreement violates the law of the state applicable to this agreement, the agreement shall be interpreted to make the maximum disclaimer or limitation permitted by the applicable state law. The invalidity or unenforceability of any provision of this agreement shall not void the remaining provisions. 1F6. Section 2. M. All liability, costs and expenses, including legal fees, that arise directly or indirectly from any of the following which you do or cause to occur. Deletions to any Project Gutenberg work, and C. Any defect you cause. Indemnity. You agree to indemnify and hold the Foundation, the trademark owner, any agent or employee of the Foundation, anyone providing copies of Project Gutenberg electronic works in accordance with this agreement, and any volunteers associated with it, with the production, promotion, and distribution of Project Gutenberg electronic works, harmless fraud, information about the mission of Project Gutenberg project. Gutenberg is synonymous with the free distribution of electronic works in formats readable by the widest variety of computers, including obsolete, old, middle-aged, and new computers. It exists because of the efforts of hundreds of volunteers and donations from people in all walks of life. In 2001, the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation was created to provide a secure and permanent future for Project Gutenberg and future generations. Volunteers and financial support to provide volunteers with the assistance they need are critical to reaching Project Gutenberg's goals and ensuring that the Project Gutenberg collection will remain freely available for generations to come. To learn more about the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation and how your efforts and donations can help, see Sections 3 and 4 and the Foundation information page at www.org, Section 3. The Foundation's EIN, or Federal Tax Identification Number, is 64,600,221,1541. Information about the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation. The Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation is a non-profit 500(c)(3) educational corporation organized under the laws of the state of Mississippi and granted tax-exempt status by the Internal Revenue Service. Contributions to the project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation are tax-deductible to the full extent permitted by U.S. federal laws and your state's laws. The Foundation's business office is located at 809 North 1500 West, Salt Lake City, UD 84116, 886, 1887. Rave equipment, including outdated equipment. Email contact links and up-to-date contact information can be found at the Foundation's website and official page at www.gutenberg.org contact section 4. Information about donations to the project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation project. Gutenberg depends upon and cannot survive without widespread public support and donations to carry out its mission of increasing the number of public domain. Licensed works that can be freely distributed in machine-readable form, accessible by the widest are. Many small donations, $1 to $5,000, are particularly important to maintaining tax-exempt status with the IRS. The Foundation is committed to complying with the laws regulating charities and charitable donations in all 50 states of the United States. Compliance requirements are not uniform, and it takes a considerable effort, much paperwork and many fees to meet and keep up with these requirements. We do not solicit donations in locations where we have not received written confirmation of compliance. To send donations or determine the status of compliance for any particular state, visit www.gutenberg.org. International donations are gratefully accepted, but we cannot make any statements concerning tax treatment of donations received from outside the United States. While we cannot and do not solicit contributions from states where we have not met the solicitation requirements, we know of no prohibition against accepting unsolicited donations from donors in such states who approach us with offers to donate. U.S. laws alone swamp our small staff. Please check the project Gutenberg web pages for current donation methods and addresses. Donations are accepted in a number of other ways, including checks, online payments, and credit card donations. To donate, please visit www.gutenberg.org, section 5. General information about Project Gutenberg, Electronic Works, Professor Michael S. Hart, was the originator of the Project Gutenberg concept of a library of electronic works that could be freely shared with anyone. For 40 years, he produced and distributed Project Gutenberg e-books with only a loose network of volunteer support. Thus, we do not necessarily keep e-books in compliance with any particular paper edition. Project Gutenberg e-books are often created from several printed editions, all of which are confirmed as not protected by copyright in the U.S. unless a copyright notice is included. Most people start at our website, which has the main PG search facility, www.org.org. This website includes information about Project Gutenberg, including how to make donations to the Project Gutenberg Literary Archive Foundation, how to help produce our new e-books, and how to subscribe to our email newsletter to hear about e-books